Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to present here. I'm Oscar Barriga. This is joint work with Thomas Busuri, Paul Corral, Carlos Rodriguez, and Emmanuel Escofias. And in this paper, we call it Sustaining Poverty Gains, a vulnerability map to guide the social policy in Senegal. Okay, so why were we doing this? Back in 2013, the Senegal Social Registry started, and it started with 75,000 households registered in the system. By 2018, the number of households in the register had increased to a little bit more than 500,000. And the importance of being in this register is that households that are in the data set are eligible to become, to be part of social programs that are developed by or that are implemented by the government of Senegal. How did we get to these 500,000 people? Well, the program was established in a way that each commune in Senegal had a quota for people that could be registered. And this quota was based on a poverty rate developed using a 2013 poverty map. So the idea is that each commune will receive a quota, and then the commune had to decide through community-level committees how to allocate this to certain households, the possibility to receive, to be visited by the National Statistical Agency and be part of a PMT process where they would receive a score that would, depending on the score, make them eligible for certain programs. But you could only be in the register if you were selected by the community and the community had a quota of how many people they could include. What was happening in late 2018 is the government established a new goal and they wanted to double the registry size. And this would imply that the registry would include 1.1 million families, which accounts to 55% of the population in the country. So the question that we wanted to do is, okay, we want to expand the quotas in the registry, but can we do better than just updating these quotas using a poverty map? And the main issue behind this expansion was we do not want to cover only poor people, we want to expand the program in a way, or the registry in a way that accounts for vulnerability, not only for poverty, but for vulnerability. And let me discuss this in a little bit more of detail. So the idea of a poverty map is that you want to target area, you don't have resources to pretty much collect information on everybody. So a poverty map allows you to target certain areas. And the challenge is that, as we were discussing in the previous presentation, targeting is very expensive in monetary, administrative, and political terms. So the geographical targeting that a poverty map establishes helps solve several of these problems and help to focalize social protection programs. The issue is that these poverty maps work best when you are able to focalize in very small geographical areas, and especially when you find geographical areas that are small and contain a very high number of poor people. That makes that the targeting using the poverty map is most effective. In Senegal, what we wanted to do is something similar. Is we wanted to create these quotas at the commune level, but we wanted to create the quotas accounting not only for poverty, and the idea of poverty is we want to cover those that are poor, but we also wanted to cover those that are vulnerable. That means make the system be able to ensure people that are not poor currently, but that are at high risk of becoming poor in the future. Okay, so let me just focus a little bit on what we use as vulnerability. Is we assume the concept behind vulnerability is the risk of households falling into poverty because of shock. These shocks can be idiosyncratic or covariate. This is something that is challenging to measure because I need not only to know the current state of the world, but also I need to know the probability that you suffer a shock and that shock is large enough to make you fall below the poverty line. In technical terms, this implies that we need to know not only the average income, but also its variance over time. And in the absence of panel data, this is challenging. So we went back, since we had this concept of vulnerability, we went back to the vulnerability literature and we were looking for methods that would allow us to estimate this vulnerability without having to rely on panel data. So we leverage Gunter and Gardner, and the approach is very useful for us because it allows to recover mean consumption and its variance just using cross-sectional data. However, this method was developed to work over household surveys, and household surveys have a limited, cannot be disaggregated, especially below regions. So in terms of targeting, the method was not good enough to guide the expansion of the quotas in the registry. And just to give you a sense of what we mean is, if we think this is the poverty line, we can have a household here that is clearly poor because it's below the poverty line. We have a household here that is above the poverty line, it means it's not poor. But we also have this kind of households that are above the poverty line. However, the variance of its income is large enough, so it's likely they fall below the poverty line. So our method was aiming at finding them, leveraging only cross-sectional data. So our method worked like this. As in a poverty map, we started with data from the household survey that was representative at the national level and for 14 regions. And then we leveraged the national census. And the advantage of the census is that it has information for every household in the country. However, the amount of information is much more limited than from a household survey. Those that have worked with a census know that the information you have there is education, household assets, and that's pretty much it, but it doesn't include the household expenditure that is the measure that we use to estimate poverty. So let me just skip this for time. So overall, the methodology, how it works is we go to the household survey and we estimate a household income generating function. And from this, we're able to estimate leveraging the predicted errors of the function, we're able to create a probability that a household falls into poverty. And then we take these methods using the common variables with the census and we impute it into every household of the census. And this allows us to create poverty and vulnerability rates for each of the communes in Senegal. These rates we create two measures: the poverty-induced vulnerability, that means those that are structurally poor, and the risk-induced vulnerability, and those are households that we consider have a probability of 29% of falling into poverty in the next year. Why 29%? We took this from the literature, but the results are consistent if we change the probability. And also had a practical advantage, and is that the register needed to have 1.1 million. When we take like poverty and the risk induced, when we choose 29%, it was just out of luck that we get to 1.1 million households. So it was also useful in that way. Okay, so the vulnerability map, it created one of the validations of the how well your poverty map is being calibrated, is that it creates in the census poverty rates, or a distribution of it creates a distribution of expenditure and poverty rates that are similar to the rates that you observe in the household survey, and we pass these tests. The census, the imputed distribution of expenditure in the census is pretty similar to the one in the household survey, and provides similar poverty and vulnerability rates as in the household survey. So we were pretty happy with the model. And of course, it allows you a high level of resolution in terms of poverty, risk-induced vulnerability, and when you are at poverty and risk, you obtain total vulnerability, and you can see the distribution of total vulnerability for each commune, or the rate of vulnerability in each commune in Senegal. Okay, so before we go into the impact of how these, or even better, to understand the impact of using vulnerability for the expansion of the quotas, it's important to understand how poverty and vulnerability are distributed. So pretty much you have two axes here. One is poverty, one is risk. If you add them up, you have vulnerability, total vulnerability. We have communes that have low levels of poverty, but when you have low levels of poverty, you can have also low levels of risks. That is, you have low levels of poverty and the share of people with a high probability of falling into poverty is low. You can also have low levels of poverty, but a high probability that people fall into poverty. What we find is that these communes that have low poverty and low risk, and by definition, low vulnerability, they tend to be concentrated around the Dakar urban area. Those that have low poverty but higher levels of risk and vulnerability tends to be these we can find several names to name them based on the limitations of the information in the household survey. We call them other urban. You can call these secondary cities, peripheral urban areas. And I think that independently of the definition, we are going to get to the same result. Is these urban areas that are not in the capital tend to have low levels of poverty, but the probability of people falling into poverty in those areas is much higher. And finally, you have what we call the chronically poor, and that is when the poverty rate is very high, you don't have a lot of people that can fall into poverty, so total vulnerability, so the rate of risk-induced vulnerability is low. And these areas of high poverty, of chronically poor levels of high levels of chronically poor households tend to be concentrated in rural areas. Then we also wanted to understand what was driving these differences, what characteristic, what was different between communes, between low poverty but with low risk and high levels of risk-induced vulnerability. And for this, we compare information in terms of household characteristics, employment, proxies for wealth, and also we leverage administrative data that was not in the survey, such as coverage of cell phone networks, nighttime luminosity, exposure to risks. And what we find is that communes with low levels of vulnerability tend to have higher education levels, better employment outcomes, are of course less likely to be rural, and that's going to be more important in a second. And not only are wealthier, but they do experience a higher levels of access to services. And we also have a marginal result in lower levels of risk exposure due to floods, but that result the difference is not very significant. Okay, so what was the impact of using the vulnerability map in expanding the community level quotas for the National Social Registry in Senegal? If we had leveraged only the poverty rate as a way to distribute the quotas, urban Senegal would have had 82% of the, or like 8% of all the, done? Okay, I need 1 minute. 8% for urban Dakar, 22% for other urban areas, and 55% for rural. When you account for total vulnerability, the increase the quotas are higher. But importantly, the quotas for urban areas increased by 80%, while in rural areas only by 30%. So by including a concept of vulnerability in the definition of the quotas, you expand the program, like the capacity of the program to reach households, particularly in urban areas. And this is going to help you to protect the past poverty gains that the country had experienced. And the last thing that I wanted to say is, of course, challenges in identification of households remain because we're still depending on community-level identification of households for the register. We need still to build a social protection system that is dynamic. That means that it's able to update itself more often, and that is also tailored to be able to manage shocks. And that's something that the quotas, the definition of quotas is just one step towards being able to improve the system in these dimensions. Thank you.